Question number 5, Materia Ture.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. Tēnā koutou I te whare. My question is to the Minister of Finance and Arts. Ka tū aia I runga I te mana o tāna tauākī mō te ahu miraka ko, quote, is an industry that's going to be under pressure, end quote.
No, I listened to the translation. It was as recorded. Minister of Finance like to answer? The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, yes, clearly many farmers are doing it tough and there is a lot of uncertainty about the future of milk prices. Farms with high levels of debt and high production costs will come under real pressure, whereas six months ago they may have thought they could hold on until prices bounce back up. That looks much less likely now. So it's appropriate that the dairy industry is thinking about reducing production costs, adapting to capital scarcity, rather than waiting for prices to rise.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Materia Ture.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Minister take any responsibility for the enormous pressure dairy farming families are under, given his government has encouraged them to convert to dairy, to take on more debt, to intensify their farms, and now 5,000 families could lose their farms because of it?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, I'd be very surprised if the member spoke with any of those families that their business decisions were made by what they read from press releases from the government. These people are capable, competent people who weigh up the business risks and decide what risks they will take. Some of them might have overextended themselves, and I'd be surprised if they blamed anyone else for that.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Materia Ture.
Does he accept that the government's goal of doubling food exports by 2025 and subsidising irrigation was an encouragement to farming families to increase their debt and intensify their farms?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, no. One would only have to look at the range of debt across farms in the dairy industry or any other industry, and you'd find that some of them have no debt, some of them have moderate debt, and a few, probably a very few, have levels of debt that are now turning out to be higher than are comfortable. The government has made no apology for supporting primary production through its investment in science and innovation, its investment in biosecurity, and getting alongside them in the development of large-scale irrigation schemes, into which we've actually only put quite small amounts of money.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Richard Prosser.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister, will the Minister's government support New Zealand First's Receiverships Agricultural Debt Mediation Amendment Bill, which will provide our dairy farmers with a similar level of regulated debt mediation support to that enjoyed by farmers in Australia and Canada, and if not, why not?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, no we won't, because we believe that the parties involved in that debt are capable of working their way through it. The large banks have lent money to the industry in full knowledge of all the risks and with a deep understanding and history in the industry. We believe they are committed to the long-term future of the industry, that it's in their interest that, for instance, the land price is maintained at reasonable levels and does not drop rapidly, and therefore they and the farmers will be able to work through whatever stress there is.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Materia Ture.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Has the Minister received any advice on how many families in wider rural communities, not just farm owners, but farm labourers and contractors as well, who will have financial problems because of his government's failed dairy strategy?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, no. And it is a bit galling to hear from the Greens concern for people who they have branded for the last decade as reckless capitalist polluters. Suddenly they're very worried about them. I find that a wee bit hard to find the Greens are serious.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Richard Prosser.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister, given his previous answer, what contingency plan does his government have in the likely event of widespread farm foreclosures to support unsecured creditors and their staff and families in the heartland communities who support the dairy industry and rely on it? Feed suppliers, fences, silage and hay contractors,
Order, bring the
diesel
question
mechanics,
to a conclusion.
vets, engineering trucking firms.
Order.
Doesn't he have one?
Question's too long. The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there is no evidence or no good reason to believe that there will be widespread farm foreclosures. The government believes the industry is resilient, that the financial services sector who support it have an interest in its ongoing success, and if that member wants to do what farmers would regard as show strong support for them, then he and his party would vote for the Trans-Pacific Partnership and vote for Resource Management Act reforms. And I'm sure if they went around the region saying that, they'd be welcomed with open arms.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Materia Ture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What will the Minister do to prevent more of our productive land being sold off to overseas buyers when farming families are suffering huge debt burdens and are forced to sell their farms?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, anyone who wants to buy the farms has to go through, any offshore buyer has to go through the Overseas Investment Act process, which includes, I think, 15 separate tests. It's been subject to court action in recent years that have raised the thresholds, and the government has every intention of leaving that in place. The member needs to keep in mind that those families who do have high levels of debt probably incurred that from paying fairly large amounts for the farm that they've moved into recently. And I think the industry would expect that they have the opportunity to work through their stressful situation with the banks.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Materia Ture.
Given the Minister has no advice on how many farming families will suffer as a result of this, does he think he ought to go and get that advice? And does he intend to act on any advice he is given about projects or initiatives to support those farming families who will be suffering financially from the government's failed strategy?
Order. It's question time, not speech time. The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you don't need to get advice to know that there'll be a significant number of farming families distressed. This is not a new kind of phenomenon in farming communities. I recall myself in the late 80s and early 90s in the sheep and beef industry, a number of years actually of fairly intensive stress over the same sorts of issues. We have a lot of confidence in this farming community to be able to adapt to difficult circumstances and to get through those on the basis that the outlook for the dairy industry is quite strong in the light of ongoing global demand for protein.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaking to the Minister, does the Minister believe that actions speak louder than words? And if that's the case, would farmers of New Zealand expect political parties who claim to be standing up for them to vote for the Trans-Pacific Partnership that will reduce hundreds of millions of dollars of tariffs against them? Or will they see through all of this as crocodile tears?
Again, the question is too long. The first part can be addressed. Order. Point of order, Chris Hopkins.
Mr. Speaker, I thought you would probably rule the question out of order. The Minister of Finance has no responsibilities for how other parties vote in the Parliament.
Order. No, as I heard the first part of the question in my mind was in order, in that it simply asked for, it didn't talk about opposition parties, other political parties' support. Wouldn't that be the best thing for farmers? I think in the view of the circumstances where the discussion's been, that question is in order. It can be addressed by the Minister.
Well, look, I'm sure that distressed farming families would take some notice of the outpouring of sympathy they're getting from opposition parties, but knowing farming people, I think they would regard actions as more telling, and they will be surprised to know that those expressing the strongest sympathy today have said they will vote against Resource Management Act reforms which will assist that industry, and vote against the most recent free trade agreement of which the dairy industry is the biggest beneficiary. They might be surprised having heard the words today.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, material.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Order. Just want a little more silence before we... Supplementary question, material.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can the Minister confirm that the TPA promise of a tariff reduction of just 1.3% by 2030 is not going to help the 5,000 farming families who are facing the loss of their farms today because of his government's failed dairy strategy?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, no, I disagree with that. The dairy industry would be, I'm sure, pleased to see any expression of real economic support from this Parliament. And secondly, that agreement includes significant benefits for other members of their communities, people in the beef industry and the horticulture industry. And actually, dairy farmers care about those people and they care about their communities. And they would expect the Greens to change their mind and vote for the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement.
Supplementary question, David Seymour.
Does the Minister agree with the following quote from the valedictory speech of outgoing Green MP Russell Norman, and I quote, "Let's just say it, we have too many cows"?
I don't think there's any need for that question to go any further. It's out of order. Question number